So welcome back to Fabulous Folklore. We are on our third interview episode, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Rich Blackett, who is an author, podcaster, Pagan Federation officer, and chair of Asatru UK, the largest inclusive heathen organisation in the UK and a fellow Northerner. So, Rich, would you like to introduce yourself further?
Thank you for having me on. I see it's always a pleasure to chat to you again, as we chatted on the folk horror thing that we did together. And you even turned up to one of my sort of presentations on Edgeways, which was great fun as well. So that's been excellent. And yeah, so as I say, I've been involved in heathenry and paganism for a number of years. I won't claim to be a veteran or an expert in everything, but like all of these things, I know a guy or a girl or a person who can sort of give me advice. And I would never ever claim to be a complete expert, but I have a quite good overview of the situation, what's going on, some of the general trends that are happening. And I got involved in heathenry about 5 or 6 years ago. I went to a moot in Cumbria and didn't fully explain what it was to my wife until we were halfway there, much to her increasing horror. But it all turned out very well. We met a whole bunch of people and it was a really good weekend. And I've attended every event they've run since then. I don't think I've missed a single one in 5 or 6 years now. And time has gone on. I ended up becoming chair of that organization.
Power off.
Do you hear that? The bloody soundbar, we can't disable it. Shall I start again? Because you don't want to hear that in your recording. That's appalling.
Right, okay. I was just going to say, so we'll go from, so I'll sort of say like, so introduce yourself, and then obviously you can just do all that again.
That's fine, that's fine. Just
so how about introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks again. I see it's good to catch up with you. And obviously we've spoken once or twice on Facebook and other forms of social media. I think I've been following your podcast for a couple of years as well. And I think we've interacted on the Folklore Revival and some of the Mark Norman stuff, been involved in that. And of course, if there is time, we can get into Black Jackie, although he's not particularly connected to heathenry, but that's another favourite topic of mine. So as you said before, I'm involved in all kinds of parts of heathenry and paganism in the UK. I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but I know a lot of people who are involved in that and take a lot of advice from that. And I got involved in heathenry because as I've said on a few other occasions, I wanted to connect with something older, but I couldn't quite put it into words. Just one random day. And I joined loads of Facebook groups and gradually left the ones that were just nothing but memes, or the ones that were a bit dodgy, or the ones that seemed to have no traffic, till I eventually ended up in this one particular group that I really, really liked. And I think in the first day there, somebody was being really unpleasant and they were kicked out within a few hours. I thought, oh, well, that's a good sign. They're good, strong moderation. Well, a good, strong moderation policy is pretty good. And so that encouraged me. And then I attended a moot in Cumbria and with my wife, and we had a lovely weekend there, and I attended the next one in York, and so on and so on. So I've been going to those events for years and years now, and some of the biggest events and the smallest events, and I ended up becoming the chair of that same group. And the group has gone from strength to strength, and that's Asatru UK, as you mentioned in the beginning there. And we are, I think, the largest heathen organisation in the UK now. That's
pretty impressive.
Yes, I mean, it's not all down to me. I shouldn't reclaim it all that, because it is the members and the many sort of dedicated committee members and all the people who are involved, and all the other moots and other sort of kindreds and groups that have spun off from that. Really, it's members. It's not me. And I've always sort of said that I don't want to be classed as like the head of heathenry or anything like that. Absolutely not, because you say if you know anything about heathens, they really don't like an organized, structured religion. I mean, it's quite true in paganism, but doubly so in heathenry, which is, as you might say, is a sub-brand of paganism. I'm sure we'll get into that.
So obviously, if anyone's never come across Asatru UK before, this is going to sound really transactional, but like, what would you say the organisation sort of offers its members, and sort of what are the goals of the organisation?
The goals of the organisation were always to sort of, it was founded by some people who were sort of a committee before me in a sense, and they did fantastic work, and it began in a small sort of pub meeting in York, about 9 years ago, and they sort of said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we?" And so essentially, what heathenry is a belief, a religious belief, generally, in the pre-Christian Northern European religions. That's a very, very broad sense of explaining that. So if you think of your belief in Thor and Odin, or Woden and Thunor, and depending upon whether it's Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian and so on, and that sort of thing. And we're interested that some were coming from a sort of historical thing. Some were pagans who kind of found a bit more interest in that. Some had even come from sort of the reenactment community and things like that. They're all coming from different perspectives and wanting to get involved. And if we're going to do this, how can we do it in a way that's inclusive? And I don't mean that in a kind of naff way. I mean that in a way that, because if a religion is going to grow and bring people into it, you can't be keeping people out. It's a simple thing. And this small group began to have these little moots and groups sort of meeting up around the country, and set up this big Facebook group, which has grown slowly but surely. We don't add in tons of people every week. We have quite a high bar of entry, which is be things like, you must live in the United Kingdom. That's the first thing. And we get a lot of interest from people from America, but there are some very positive groups over there as well. So, things, the group like the Troth is pretty good. So we were trying to sort of build this nice inclusive thing, but also encourage people to form their own local little communities and have their own local practices and that sort of thing. So it's not about setting a rule and this is how you must do heathen and we shall say. It's not about that at all. There are sort of types of paganism, I presume, which are like that, but that's not what we're about. But also make scholarship and stuff like that available. Somebody says, well, what's the response to this? Is there a heathen naming ceremony? Well, no. But how can we create one? Because there's clearly a need for that. Is there evidence of a heathen marriage ceremony? Well, yes, there is, but how applicable is that to modern people? And those sorts of things. So those are the sort of conversations which are interesting. As well as that, you get people who are perhaps intuitive, that nothing to do with the scholarship side, and or just have more sort of, let's say psychics, that sort of probably puts too heavy a gloss on it, but people who have a more sort of like a feelings about how things should be, and that's fine too. And where you can get these people who are into the academic side and people into the more intuitive side to kind of work together and get some very interesting stuff happening there. So again, it's all about creating a space where people can have these small little groups.
So it sounds like there's a degree of flexibility there, because I suppose with some of the different sort of pagan paths, there's like quite a well-established format for things. And obviously some of the paths are a little bit more kind of reconstructions based on where there's been evidence. Like, for example, the Romans are marvelous at writing things down. So obviously you've got a set of practices that you can sort of take from that. So I guess it sounds a bit like heathenry is based a little bit more on reconstructions, but also how you would make something flexible to work in a completely different century.
Well, absolutely. We're not living in the Bronze Age or the Iron Age or the early medieval period. Although some people like to dress up in that clothing, that's not compulsory. I don't do that, but a lot of people feel comfortable when they're doing a ritual, whatever. They might, oh, well, I'd like to wear the clothes of the time and that sort of thing. But that's not important. That's not part of it. You don't have to have tattoos. You don't have to have long hair. A lot of people do, but you don't have to. So that's part of it. So yes, the reconstruction is part of it, but it's important to not be too heavy on that, because if you're purely doing reconstruction all the time, then that's going to, becomes very dry. And there's a very limited pool of information out there. So we have to take what is there and analyze it. And, there are academics who are heathens as well, so they will come in and analyze it. But again, there will come a point where there is nothing. What does it say about that? Or, because to say that we should adopt all the practices of Vikings, for want of a better phrase, from history. Well, no, you shouldn't. In the same way, you wouldn't want to adopt all the lifestyle of somebody from the 17th century either, because there'd be some things that they do that you think, well, that's not very appropriate. So it's about what's the modern response to that as well, I think is certainly, and in each kind of kindred or group might have a different take on that. And that's fine. And I look forward to seeing all that sort of regional differences.
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking about the idea of sort of historical sort of reconstructions of earlier periods. The thing that always makes my skin crawl is the minute you get to dental care, and I'm like, I quite like the 21st century, thanks. But that's
well, there's a slightly gruesome joke. It's sort of, everybody wants to go back to the Bronze Age, but when I propose bringing back intestinal parasites, everyone's like, "Oh no, stop there!" Because exactly when people have done actual archaeological analysis of bodies that are found in York, for example, from the Viking sort of period, they had a pretty tough life, pretty grim in a lot of respects. You can see that they've done heavy labor their entire lives, that their sort of their spine and their sort of their hip joints and stuff. It wasn't a life of luxury at all. It was very hard life, for the 99% of people. Probably even for the 1% of the richest people, they had a pretty grim life compared to now. So certainly I wouldn't want to go back. I would perhaps want to observe, but I wouldn't want to go and live in that time.
Yeah, to visit, but as long as you could come back.
Well, yes. I mean, for a start, the food would be incredibly bland to our modern palate, because it's all the spices and things that we take for granted. Sugar, you might have a bit of honey if you're very wealthy, or even salt. You'd have some of that, but a lot of the herbs and spices that we think of as just typical, easy things didn't exist. Food would have been spectacularly bland. So, as a bit of a foodie myself, that's a horrifying prospect. Before we even get to the dental care, which
yeah, I suppose obviously one of the things I was thinking when I asked if you wanted to come on was because people keep asking me questions about heathenry and sort of Norse mythology in particular, and it's not really my area, so I thought I would bring someone on who knew. But I also obviously had to think, who can I bring on to talk about it who I know doesn't have a problematic relationship to
well, if you want to get into that, we can talk about that, absolutely. Now, heathenry has an unfortunate dark history, which we must acknowledge. And the reason I mentioned earlier on is that our group was inclusive, is that there are various heathen groups, I'm not going to name them, which are very exclusive, and they believe that heathenry or Northern European traditions are only for indigenous Northern Europeans, which they mean white people. So that's really what they're getting at, which is an unfortunate, ugly side of the history of heathenry, going back, unfortunately, all the way to the 19th century, to the kind of folklore boom. Where folklore was tied in very much with nationalism and all those sorts of things, not just in England, but across every country in Europe. And however, as it's grown and grown, as more people coming into it, it's by very nature has become more diverse. And that's once those groups started to sort of splinter off, because there was a parting of the ways, particularly in America, where there's two groups that had been sort of in an uneasy sort of alliance. And when it became clear that one group said, well, it's only for white people, although they didn't say that, they, the usual sort of dog whistle type words. And another group said, well, actually, no, we should be open to anybody, the gods call who they will, that sort of approach. And that led to very much a parting of the ways there. But it still has that negative association with a lot of people's minds. When they see runes, they think, looks a bit Nazi. Well, all that sort of stuff, which is why we work very, very hard to put a very different image forward, and to sort of work with the Pagan Federation, and to reach out to various, I mean, we're not a perfect, no group is perfect, but we strive to be less wrong. We strive to be more inclusive to people of color, people of different, sort of genders and sexualities and that sort of thing, and to be accepting of that. And also to be fine for anybody to attend, and that should be where it should be and how it should always have been. And people will say, oh, well, 1,000 years ago or 15, the Vikings wouldn't. Well, yeah, we don't live 1,000 years ago. We don't live 15. We live where we do now. We live in the modern world where people have more intelligence and understanding, and society is improving. We don't want to bring back slavery, because the Vikings had an awful lot of slaves. We don't want to bring back that either. Thank you very much. So that is very much what we're about here, to sort of to have this more inclusive approach to let people be as heathen as they want to be, but also retain their identity. Doesn't mean you have to give up this or even have a political point of view. You say, oh, well, you must be right wing to be, you must be left wing to. Well, no, it's not about that. It should be something separate to that, you know. So that's what we're trying to do. If that makes sense. I mean, I'm happy to expand on that a bit more.
No, I know what you mean, because I think it's because of the fact that the sort of the reputation that I think it's unfortunately picked up. There will be some who will sit in that camp, but obviously it's more the idea that obviously it doesn't have to be that way. And I think the fact that yeah, that is that idea of you know, the gods calling who they will, which I suppose
exactly.
you know, there are obviously some traditions around the world which are closed, and rightfully so. But I think for something like that, when you consider what merry travelers the Vikings were, you sort of think, you know, it makes sense that they would take that influence.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned closed traditions, and I'll phrase this carefully. There's somebody I know who's actually from the Northeast who has joined what you might have thought of as a closed tradition related to a sort of an indigenous Caribbean religion, and he's about as white as you can get, but he was respectful and is part of that, you know, quite clearly. So the concept of a closed tradition, yes, there's nothing wrong with that, but equally there are, I think they're closed because of people abusing that sort of closure, or attending like a weekend camp and then proclaiming themselves a priest of this or something like that, which is an awful thing to do, because you can imagine the people if they spent their whole lives fighting against oppression and some person just waltzes in and then claims something of that's appalling. However, there are roots within some of those groups where people have been respectful and people have no problem with that. So I think that's interesting as well.
So we've obviously touched on a few different types of spirituality so far, but I suppose where in the wider realm of spirituality, where would you say that heathenry kind of falls?
Well, first of all, if you think of paganism being like a big broad umbrella of pre-Christian religions, I mean, yes, you can broaden it out to other parts of the world, but if we just focus just on Europe, for example, so paganism might broadly cover all the pre-Christian ideas and concepts within Europe. So within that, you'd get things like Slavic paganism, you'd get sort of Anglo-Saxon belief, some of the, I mean, I hate to use the word Celtic, but these days they might say something like Gaelic polytheism, that sort of thing. And there's variations within that. There's people who've tried to reconstruct what a sort of Frankish sort of heathenry might look like, with very different names and things, and trying to sort of decipher that. And places like Poland, there'll be different kinds of things there. They don't know much about it, but they found a list of all the people, all the entities that people were not supposed to worship. So, so we can kind of work that back. So don't do this. So where does that lead us? And some interesting things there. And from the other side, you get I won't say pagan survivals, because I think that's been pretty much debunked, but you get the sort of folklore, sort of little tidbits here and there that maybe suggests you can sort of work it back from, well, this is what we have in the record, and this is what a bit of folklore, could there be some connection? Sometimes there isn't, but you can sort of get hints, perhaps, you know, not necessarily clear signposts, but a possibility. So in terms of heathenry, there are different kinds of heathens. So there might be people who would call themselves a hard polytheist. So the gods are real, I believe in the gods, they are deities, and I give offerings to them, and they can intercede in our lives. Other people might call themselves a soft polytheist. Well, I offer to them, but they don't care so much about me. They're kind of there, but it's not a big deal. They don't actively cause thunderstorms, do things, but I do believe they exist and I worship them. And there are people who would perhaps also call themselves heathens, but would say, oh, the gods are just archetypes. They're not real at all. They're sort of embodiments of a cultural idea. And you even get atheist heathens who like the ritual, but say the gods don't exist, but I enjoy the ritual. Now, all of the people, and many, many different sort of stripes and sort of subdivisions within that you get within heathenry. But the majority of what we do is sort of to do with the polytheistic kind of thing. There are multiple gods, and they interact with the world, and we interact with them by a ritual. So that's the too long didn't read version, I think. So,
well, I think that sort of comes into another question that I had, actually, and it was the idea of, obviously, in every tradition has its own way of approaching the gods, shall we say.
mm-hmm.
And obviously I was wondering, obviously based on this one, with my limited understanding before I chatted with you, are the gods therefore invoked or rather evoked? And obviously it was that idea of like, do people believe that they intercede on your behalf, or are they more kind of models of behavior? But it kind of sounds like you've got the
Depends who you
freedom
ask.
to believe which one you prefer.
And that's the thing is, if you ask a heathen, you'll get 3 opinions. So well, it's true. People's views change over time. I think there was a point when I first got involved with heathenry, I thought, well, we must try and find some purer, authentic version of it. Even though we're going to be inclusive, let's try and find we shouldn't be mixing it up with other things. But the more I've read, I've seen that people, for as long as they've been people, have been cherry picking. Well, I'll have a bit of this. I'll worship the Roman stuff, but I'll also do this heathen stuff. And although that might sound, particularly from a Christian, even if you've never been to church or never been confirmed, the Christian idea is you must do this one thing. You can't do 2 things at the same time. Before Christianity, that was quite common. People did a little bit of everything. Not everybody, but certainly people did mix it up a lot more, that kind of syncretic concept. And when Christianity came in, some heathens would kind of pop along to the Christian church, but also do their heathen rituals. Unfortunately, not realizing this is like a one-way path. You can't come back from that, because that's the way Christianity functions as a sort of as a belief system. It's our way or no way. You can't. So once you start to dip your toe in generally, particularly with the overculture. So that idea of blending little bits of different things or changing your beliefs as you go on is also healthy, I think, to sort of, as you learn new things. There's also the concept in heathenry, but also in paganism in general, something called UPG. I don't know if you've ever come across that. Depends who you ask. Again, it has 2 different meanings. So it can be unverified personal gnosis, or unknown personal gnosis, or gnosis and GNOSIS. So this idea of that you've had a spiritual experience which might align with what we know in the sources, or might completely contradict them. So it's true for you, but isn't necessarily true for everybody. Now, later on, you might find something that confirms that. You think, oh, this is very interesting. I've had a spirit, or you might never experience that. But I think the idea is that you shouldn't then try to sort of enforce that personal event on other people. It's like saying, if you had a dream where Odin did this, or Odin said something to you, or you had this experience, this doesn't mean that you then say, well, everyone now has to do what I say. No, Odin spoke to, no, it doesn't work like that. So there can be very much a unique sort of personal approach to spirituality in that sense. However, if you want to get more mystical, if you can get somebody who's had a lot of those experiences with somebody who's going into the law and the academic dry side of it, and they can find a point of correlation, then that can be very interesting. That's quite rare, but it does happen. And I think that sort of combination of spiritual experiences and academia and reading, and backwards and forward, because you can't have too much without the other. You have too much reading, then you end up just lost in your books. You have too much sort of spiritual experience, well, you've got no sort of frame of reference for that. So putting those 2 together is what can get really interesting.
Yeah, I'm always lost in books. I'm like, that will be me.
Well, I'm very much guilty of that, but but it was a bit of a joke, whenever I give it to. Before we start, I've got a book to recommend. But no, that's fine. Or because when I was starting out, I didn't know what to read or didn't know what to find. So when everybody has a question, I normally have a link to an academic paper or a book, or even just something which is perhaps not academic. You say, well, there's nothing academic about this, but here's an interesting novel that covers that. Maybe that's your thing. So it's not all about being dry sort of academia. I love that side of it, but it's not for everyone.
I just love the idea that you actually cite your sources, and more people need to do that, in my humble opinion.
Well, not you don't have to cite your source. A lot of people don't. They have had a spiritual experience, and fine. You don't have to. I don't want to sort of give the impression that people, oh, you had a dream. Okay. Well, I need you to link a PDF and write an essay for me. No, I don't want that at all. I don't think that's fair, because there are people who've had sort of spiritual experiences which no source can confirm or tell them anything. Now, does that mean what they've had is invalid, or it's valid for them? So they might never find that out. That would just be an interesting thing that happened to them. So I think you've got to tread a very careful, and we try to tread a careful path with not telling people too much how to be a heathen. Give suggestions. Here's a couple of, you want to look at this, that's not for you. Well, what about looking at this? So that's very much just laying out sort of choices and options and resources for people. And some of those people have then taken that, or they've taken something else and they've formed other groups, and that's great.
No, it sounds like a different sort of way of kind of putting a practice together. And I suppose obviously everybody's going to interact with that differently. So because everyone's bringing their own experiences to it. So why shouldn't it kind of evolve over time?
Absolutely. Well, I think you're seeing that in some of the smaller groups that are developing. And this idea of having like local UPG might be. Now, this is what we do at our sort of events. Yes, it's not in any of the books, but this is what we do. Fair enough. And I think that's great when somebody's got a local practice, or somebody has an affinity for, I don't know, like boars or rams or something like that. Well, why? I don't know. I just like them. So that's going to be our thing. Going to put that on a flag because we just like it. So, okay. There's no spiritual reason for that, but if they can build a sort of an identity around that, and that's fine. Or somebody might be like boars, or might be like a stag or something like that, and it doesn't even to be an animal. But I'm just giving an example of how people can build a local practice around something, that if you're going to be doing that, and that can be form a little group identity. And I think that's healthy. It's like a strict tribal thing, but it can be a sort of a way of building like a local religious practice that nobody's telling you what to do. It's evolving organically.
Mm-hmm. So obviously we've touched on a couple of the big names, shall we say?
Yes.
And obviously, again, there's another topic that you kind of have to raise when you talk about gods from that part of the world, and obviously that's the Marvel characters of Thor and Loki, and obviously Loki in particular, I think, has quite a lot of fans.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I think it's really Tom Hiddleston has a lot of fans. It's probably
Tom Hiddleston is awesome. I mean, Chris Hemsworth seems lovely as well. But do you think the popularity of those characters, and it always irritates me when I hear people sort of complaining that they're doing something in the film because it wasn't like that in the comics, and I'm like, but it also wasn't like that in the mythology, so shush.
I think, it doesn't bother me at all, because I view them as completely separate things. I don't sort of, if people enjoy the movies, then great. If they enjoy the comics, or if the comics are wrong or right, it doesn't really matter to me. There's an awful lot of people have come into heathenry because of the TV show Vikings, which is about as accurate as nothing. But I love the show. It's a great, fun show, but it's you don't go to that for historical accuracy. Even the makers of the program themselves have said that they could have made it 100% accurate, and it would have got heaps of praise and lasted for 2 seasons and then got cancelled, because that's they said they know that. But if they, it's entertainment, and that's fine. There's some great stuff out there that is a bit more accurate. Although it's kind of funny, is the show Norseman.
I love Norseman.
There's actually more accuracy in Norseman than there is in Vikings, believe it or not. So there's some, and it's played for laughs, but there is some moments there in Norseman which are quite funny. And I think somebody had this great description of what Vikings is like in terms of history. Imagine Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill are brothers who fight Napoleon Bonaparte. So yes, but no. That's essentially the sort of, it's mixing up different periods and different characters and real people and mythological people. And doesn't mean, to be fair, if somebody did make a movie like that, I would certainly watch it. So that sounds tremendous. But so there's nothing wrong with having entertainment and things like that, which have little bits of, but often what I found is people have watched the show and seen the odd bits of spirituality in it. And they'll maybe join our group, or they'll come along to one of the big meetings we have in New York, start asking questions. And when they find out the actual stuff, they either go, oh, that's not for me, or they go, oh, this is even more interesting than I thought. So they kind of get sort of, the show's fun, but the actual thing behind it is even more interesting. So that's fine. It's other people have come to it from reading Lord of the Rings, because there's a lot of stuff that Tolkien put in Lord of the Rings, like the names of the dwarves is in the Völuspá and that sort of thing. And Gandalf is another name for Odin, Gandalfur, and various things like that. And people have come to it from that, and they start, well, where is this from? And they say, oh, well, it's from this, and they come to it that way. And so people come to it in different ways. So it doesn't bother me if somebody is a huge fan of Marvel, but also a heathen. I mean, if they, I mean, Loki isn't quite how he's portrayed in the films, but who is, So that's. Although some people would say he's exactly the same as he's portrayed in the film, so it depends who you ask. But no, I don't view it as a problem. I think, if you want to depict all the gods in different ways, and that's fine. It's just entertainment. And
because that was one of the things I was going to ask, actually, because obviously I remember in like the late 1990s when sort of you had Willow and Buffy and like lots of sort of like teenage girls sort of really discovered witchcraft, and then obviously there's been a resurgence of interest recently. And I was sort of wondering, like, what is the inspiration for someone then discovering heathenry? Is it likely to be something like Vikings or
some of it
Marvel?
is, some of it is, or sometimes the people will just see, or just a general interest in history, or they might see some of our big shared posts on, we have they have the public group and like the private group, and we try to put some interesting stuff on the public group, so people are, well, what's all this about? We just have some, like a nice picture with a little link to something. Sometimes it's lighthearted, sometimes it's serious, and sometimes it's the dry academic stuff, which I love, but I try not to put too much of that there, because that only appeals to a very narrow group of people, and that's fair enough. But I've got to the stage now where, if I buy a book and it doesn't have massive, giant sort of footnotes and a copious bibliography, but I know that 10 years ago I would go, oh no, not for me. But I'm kind of gone the other way with academic books now. But I think but that's not for everyone. A lot of people see a book like that as just impenetrable, and that's not, we don't want to turn people away because of that. So I think if people come to it in different ways, and particularly when they come to one of our events and we do some of the big sort of rituals and get people to participate, and some people like it, some people say, oh, it's not for me, that's fine, but other people have been spiritually moved, for want of a better phrase, and that has made them want to go and read more and sort of delve into it in different ways. And I think that's healthy to do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's maybe a possibility that people kind of possibly focus on the gods a little bit too much and kind of ignore all the other many spiritual beings that kind of play a role in these sort of traditions?
Well, I know that at the rituals that we do, we mention the gods, but we would mention things like, we mention the spirits of the land and spirits of place. Now, traditionally, that word would be wight, but W-I-G-H-T. But well, if you're in a big public place and so like hail the wights, people may get the wrong impression. So we generally say hail the spirits, but generally the wights would be like the sort of the spirits that inhabit your land or even your house and that sort of thing. So there's a very simple ritual would be, every time you get a bottle of beer, you pour a little thimble out or a little shot glass out for the wights and leave it out for 24 hours and throw it away. Or if it's for your garden, well, you wouldn't put alcohol perhaps because that's very bad for plants. You might put something like, old food or something like that, or rotting fruit, which would be sort of decay and feed the plants and that sort of thing. Or even if the creatures that live in your garden might eat it. There's a historical account by an Arabic traveller, and the people leave out all this meat that they're going to offer to the gods. And then he says, but your dogs are just nicking it. Well, how is that? And they said, oh, that's fine. That's all right. And he's completely bamboozled by that. But that was certainly, now, were those people actually heathen? But it's the closest we've got. There was obviously some kind of close culture. That's a fascinating account by somebody called Ibn Fadlan. And it was from a point of view of an Arabic traveller, and he has to have things translated for him. So who knows quite what was maybe lost in translation there. But that's a really interesting account to sort of see that. So you get to talk about like the spirits of the land, the spirits of the place, and that sort of thing. It's certainly not about commanding those spirits. And it's not like in some Wiccan or high magic things where you order the spirit and I will bind you to this place. And no, that is a tradition in something. It's not for me, but that is part of it. Because I've seen some people do that. But in heathen, it's all about we invite. If you'd like to do this, we're going to. We'd like to be respectful to. I mean, even if you're not spiritual at all or religious at all, if you go somewhere, you treat it with respect. Something as that, you don't leave your litter on the floor. Well, this is the place where we're going to do our ritual. Let's make it nice and clean. Simple things like that. But if you add the religious aspect to that and say, well, we're doing this because we're respecting the spirits of place and we're not going to damage it, and do that sort of thing. And I mean, the idea of house whites is an interesting one as well. because it's potentially linked to trolls. I read in one story where the trolls got so small and got fed up with being hunted, and they became so small they started to live in people's houses and to help them out. Is that, well, that's folklore, so that's much later sort of concept.
It's such a lovely story, though.
It's from this fantastic book called Trolls and Their Relatives, which is a brilliant book. Not entirely PC, because it has like the first ever Scandinavian bombing his wife on the head and dragging her by her hair, the usual sort of 1970s comedy. But it has some really interesting stuff about the as long as you leave offerings to the little things that live in your house. You must have seen those pictures of like, the gnomes with like little red cone hats.
Tomtes.
Tomte or the Nissen. There's various other names throughout sort of Europe, in fact, for those, and those are meant to be the embodiment of the spirit of your house, in a sense. So you leave little offerings and leave a bit of cake out or leave a bit of food out. And it's not about leaving a giant cake out, it's leaving a small bit, little and often, that sort of concept. I mean, you see that in Neil Gaiman's the American Gods, where the woman leaves out a little bit of cake, like that spirit and that sort of, that's where that concept comes from. Some people say that is where we get the concept of leaving a mince pie and a glass of sherry out for Santa. Well, that's a bit of a tenuous link, perhaps, but it's a nice one, but it's a bit tenuous.
Yeah, and I only pulled the face before the idea of commanding spirits, because it just always seems a little bit like, well, do you at least say please? Because that was the thing as well, because obviously my interest is usually in what the Romans do, and when you look at their concept of like the lares and also speaking to house spirits more because of the fact that they're closer to you, therefore they're more likely to intercede on your behalf. And I just think, well, why wouldn't you be nice to them? if you're in a position where you're sharing space with someone, you want to be a good housemate.
Exactly. I mean, there's people, not everybody thinks that land wights or land spirits and house spirits, can actually have that power of intercession. That's a theological discussion to be had there. In the same way with where people leave offerings to ancestors or people who they're descended from, that again gets into a very complex conversation, because what if you don't like the people who brought you up? Well, I don't want to pray to them. I don't want to give offerings to them. But in the theology that I've seen and the things, but there may be ancestors of spirit, and that is certainly in sort of older accounts of heathenry, where people would claim to be a descendant of somebody. Well, they clearly weren't by any measure, even by the biology of the time, but they were embodied the spirit of that person. So that kind of, I am in the tradition of, and I am a descendant of, but descendant was a much looser kind of concept then. So even if there's nobody in your family you like, there'll be somebody in your life who guided you, who taught you where might be that one teacher who took a shine, who said, well, why don't you read this book, or why don't you do this? Or it might be somebody who, the next door neighbor who always used to do you right at Christmas and bring you a turkey, or they passed away, but you remember them. So that would also be an ancestor, in a sense, of that kind of broad, ancestors of blood and spirit and that kind of thing. Because I think it's important to get away from the idea that only white ancestors and only white, so you see where that gets into a very, very, that can get into a dodgy territory, not intentionally, but it can sort of lead to that sort of ideology, perhaps. And I think it's important that the concepts of what that might mean can be very different, because remember, most of our ancestors for the past 1500 years were Christians, so maybe they don't want you to leave offerings to them. So they might be mortally offended at that sort of thing. So how do you sort of do that respectfully? And that's another complex theological sort of concept, because you've got to remember the most recent sort of ancestor. I think is important, rather than like harking back to the oldie Viking days. And I think that's also important as well, because it might be somebody who was who looked after you or brought you up, or is somebody who you think like, well, they certainly embody the qualities that I'd want to have. Whether you are biologically related to them doesn't matter. You say, well, I want to be like them. I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think that sort of is probably more helpful, because I think one of the things people don't always want to necessarily acknowledge is that they will have ancestors who will have done really, really awful things.
Absolutely.
And that's like one of my problems with programs like Who Do You Think You Are? The fact that they always focus on like the celebrity gets really overly attached to someone, and then they get really upset when it turns out that they were actually a bit of a wrong un. And I'm like, well, chances are one of them was going to be. So I think it the idea of sort of following more that kind of like almost mentorship and role model approach, I think is probably a little bit, what's the word, less fraught with problems.
Absolutely. Because as a friend of mine came to one of the events, because I've known her for years and years, and she was like, what's this weird group you're getting involved with? I said, oh, they're fine. He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, come to one of our events and see what it's like. And she said, well, it's not for me, but I get it. And one of the things we do, I mean, pre-COVID, we used to pass the horn because then we would take a sip. We don't do that now because, but pre-COVID, it was a small group. You'd pass the horn around, everybody would say something about the gods, and you'd say something about, ancestors of blood or spirit, and you'd mention somebody. And my friend said, well, I'm going to mention, she mentioned this particular guy, I think it was a teacher or somebody she'd known from her past who was passed away. And she said, I'm going to mention him because if he was here, he would have loved this, and hail to him. And that's exactly what it's about. So people will mention, somebody who was very instrumental in them being there. That sort of concept is pretty important. I think also the idea of ancestry and descendant, we have, because of our modern understanding biology, we think, oh, well, it must be somebody who's biologically or been raised by. But as you probably know, in your sort of things up here in the Northeast, where people would have a claim on the kingship, there would be, be somebody who would, claim on the throne. That didn't mean they were a descendant. That just meant they were a pretty cool guy. So he's got an army, therefore claim on the throne. It's not like he's the third or fourth son. Irrelevant. This guy has an army. He has a claim on the throne. That's how it works. So it was a very different sort of concept of descendant and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, like, obviously where we're from, like the border reavers, you could sort of be adopted by a family, and then become part of that particular sort of group, and you didn't actually have to be a blood relative.
Of course not.
And I sort of think it's a bit like when you sort of think about people having a claim to the throne, you think how many kings had children that weren't legitimate. So that, if you took your descendant or your ancestors back far enough, you could quite easily be descended from one of them.
Well, exactly. And I think also, you could, I think certainly in the past, adoption was much more common because people would die of all kinds of terrible things. You broke your leg, you might not live from that, and all kinds of things. And as we said earlier about, like, health was pretty gruesome and grim. So I think adoption was all far more common than we might think of now. Because if a child was healthy, well, that could be a good thing for your community. You're not going to kick out a healthy kid. If the kid's healthy, well, his mum and dad have died, but he or she's healthy. Well, that would be good for our family. So I think in that sort of that community sense is also very, very important to me in terms of heathenry, as to how that's going to. And I don't mean just the heathen community, but the community in the biggest sense, because I think it shouldn't be this introverted, inward looking, should be outward looking, because nothing will change people's minds about what it means to be a Viking heathen dude who worships Odin. They think, well, that's a bit weird. But if they see the person doing positive things in their community, they think, well, it's a bit odd, but I see where that is. I've met them, I see where that's coming from. So I think that's very much part of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Another question I had, obviously, before we kind of get into like the last few, was the other big thing that I think people think about when they think of like Norse, in particular, cosmology, and again, thanks to Marvel, is the concept of Ragnarok.
Oh, yes.
So, given a lot of the doomsday prophecies and things that you periodically pop up as memes and so on, is that still part of heathenry, or is that sort of considered as being what was originally in the sagas?
It depends who you ask, because again, you've got to think of when the sagas were written.
Yeah.
And the ones that survive were written in Iceland. So almost certainly strongly influenced by the landscape of Iceland, the volcanoes and the sort of volcanic activity there, and the steam and all those sorts of things. And they were written down. Now that's not to dismiss them, but let's just say you must understand that could very well have been an influence there. And then they were written down, oral tradition, a long time later, by a Christian monk. So there's points of things to be sort of unpicked there a little bit. But Ragnarok, again, depends who you ask. Some heathens will say, well, in the future there will be Ragnarok. That's going to be the end of the world, and that kind of the apocalypse at some indeterminate point in the future. Or you could say that Ragnarok is always happening. It's a constant renewal of things. Things are always falling apart and then regrowing. And that point, that more sort of theological, sort of philosophical type point of view. And of course, in Anglo-Saxon heathenry, there ain't no Ragnarok at all. There's no sources talk about it. So you can be an Anglo-Saxon heathen, you don't have to worry at all. That's fine. But there is the further concept, which is something called mythic time. Mythic time being that, because if you read some of the stories and the sagas, the Norse myths, at some point Loki's a good person, in other ones he's a bad person, in other ones he's Odin's best mate in some of them, and sometimes Baldur's there, but Baldur's dead in other sort of ones, and all of those sort of well, which order should they be in? Well, maybe they aren't. I don't have to, because it's like mythic time. It's a constantly happening thing. It's outside our concept of linear time. So that sort of concept that it's not that because they're not bound by our concept of time and our kind of linearity, which is why you could say they are eternal or that sort of thing. I know one person compared it to the idea of the prophets in, I think it's Deep Space Nine, these sort of entities that exist outside us. I thought, well, that's certainly a take on it, but it's not quite. But that's the idea. These. So if you view it from that point of view, it's a mythic time. It's always happening, but not happening. So it's happening outside of our concept. So yes, Ragnarok has happened, or it hasn't happened, or it will happen. Yes. So because it is a non-linear sort of concept. I'm kind of fascinated by that, but again, there's other things that could have influenced Ragnarok as well, because there was a very, very significant sort of global event in, I think, the 6th century, when whether it was a volcano, whether it was a meteor, but something happened globally that caused no proper summer for 2 years. And it's not just in the north, but it hit obviously the northern sort of places really, really hard. It's mentioned in China, it's mentioned in Rome, and something. It was called the solar veil event, solar veil, and that certainly influenced cosmology as well, because sun worship was very much a part of sort of Norse heathenry at that time, and that drops away to nothing. You can see that the archaeological record. So that's no longer a big thing. Whereas the very oldest stuff we've got from like the Bronze Age, there's all these kind of curious sun wheels and things, and they just get smaller and smaller and smaller on the carvings until they're no longer relevant. So that's certainly this idea of this Fimbulwinter, this ultimate winter that's going to be this thing that's going to be devastating and make all the crops die and we'll all die, and but even that, it says that that's just that bit, then everything starts again, and certain gods survive, and then Odin is reborn, and then it all starts again. So it's not just the end of the world. It's like, well, that all ends then, and there's various sort of gods. I mean, some of the more obscure ones people might not have heard of, like Hörnir, who's barely mentioned. He's meant to be one of the gods who survive.
I quite like the idea of that, actually, because I mean, even in sort of, if you look in physics and you look at the fact that, when stars get to the end of their lifespan and then explode and send all the material they're made of out into space, and then they start eventually to form into new stars, you kind of think the universe seems relatively good at recycling and restarting anyway. So
oh, absolutely. I think that's well, it again depends. I mean, some people don't worry about it at all, but it generally is. So he's a new heathen. It's one of the first questions they have. So, what about Ragnarok? Do I go to or Valhalla? Do I go to Valhalla?
Oh yeah.
Well, it's a nice idea, and it's, if you're coming from a Christian background, or even if you've never been to church in your life, you have this idea: when you die, you go a place. Well, not necessarily, because the Valhalla concept was much, much later. So was it even a real thing? Was it them just trying to have a rival thing to heaven in the Christian sort of concept?
It's also quite a good incentive to fight in battle as well, let's be honest.
Well, that's the thing. That's very much what it was, because people historically in that time, they wanted to be buried in the land where their parents are buried or their families. But if you're dying in another country several hundred miles away, they're not going to ship your body back, because it's going to be a bad idea. So you get essentially just dumped in a pit, with all your weapons, and there you go, covered in soil. There, that's it. But if you think of that concept of being dumped in a pit with this, because the hall in Valhalla is described as being made of shields. We think, well, the shields are covering the body, so it's very much a kind of symbolic way of, oh, well, if you die in battle, you don't have to be buried all the way back home. It's fine because you go to this other place. Which is, but of course, it's important to say that most Vikings or people that era did not die in battle. They were farmers, they were fishermen, they were blacksmiths, and all those sort of, or people who made cloth, all those sort of boring but very important jobs. It's like saying everybody from the 18th century was a pirate. Well, no. I mean, that would be awesome. Can you imagine the whole civilization of pirates and Jack Sparrows? But that, it sounds ridiculous. But that's essentially what we're projecting back, that they were all 9-foot warriors with absolutely ripped, with massive muscles. And well, no, they weren't. Although that would be cool if that was true, but it's the archaeology doesn't bear it out.
That would also be an incredibly, how would you keep a civilization going if every all the men were just constantly going off to fight? Like, you're going to run out of people eventually at that point.
Yes. It's not a way to build community, is it? But I think it's important to understand that did go on, but it was just a very loud bit of a much broader culture. Well, yeah, it's true, but so that's something to be acknowledged. It did happen, but it wasn't something that was what everybody was doing.
Yeah. Another question that I had actually came from a professor friend of mine and listener of Fabulous Folklore, Ed Karshner, and he was asking, Vine Deloria Jr. was a Native American philosopher, and he made the distinction that Western religions are commemorative and Native belief systems are revelatory. So where does heathenry fall on that scale? Does it fall on that scale?
A bit of both, I would say, because there is that sort of remembrance of ancestors or people who went by, who've gone by, and often when people have said to me, well, is there a ritual I can do for a person who's died? And I always say the best way to do a ritual about that is to remember every story about them and tell it to everybody you meet. That's the thing, anytime you're in a pub and somebody says, oh, I've had loads to drink last night, and you say, oh, you've got no idea. A friend of mine, he passed away, he was a drinker, let me tell you. And or somebody says, oh, well, I've been doing some, whatever their thing they're doing, and talk about their lives, sort of keep their memory alive in that sort of sense. So that's the sort of commemorative sort of side of it. I mean, I argue that you should also tell the bad stories as well, not just the good ones. Say, like, oh, this person was great, but oh, they were awful as well. And to let their whole give their whole character, and that's fantastic. To hear the warts and all sort of story of people, because you see that in some of these sagas where it tells about the good things they do and the bad things they do, and particularly some of the bad things. People like to record that. If somebody's an absolute scoundrel, they absolutely gets recorded. So you think of some of the folk heroes we have now, sort of football players, people like that. If somebody was an absolute rogue, well, there'll be dozens more books on him than on somebody who was, a paragon of virtue. And that's how you keep their sort of idea alive. Now, there is a sort of revelatory thing, as I mentioned, about the UPG side of that. And so that is a very, very smaller, localized, personal thing, rather than something that might be. You're not going to get a prophet within heathenry who says, I've spoken to Odin, this is the way forward, follow me, this is the new revelation. Something like that's going to be, I mean, people are welcome to try, but I imagine no one's going to listen, but so that sort of approach isn't really going to really happen. But there is that sort of personal sort of spiritual growth, in some ways. That is certainly part of it.
Cool. So if you could only tell people one thing to help them understand heathenry, what would it be?
You're not going to Valhalla. No, that sounds a bit mean. I think the positive thing I would say is the gods are real. That would be a nice positive thing to say, rather than anything mocking, because we were all at a certain point where we didn't know anything about heathenry. So I shouldn't, it's important to not sort of mock sort of people coming into it, because we've all been there and not knowing anything, finding our way and sort of being completely bamboozled, or buying books that are rubbish off Amazon. It's always the way within heathenry. They say that the first book you buy, well, this is amazing, I'm learning so much. Then 2 years later, like, what a load of rubbish. Now I've got a proper book on heathenry. Now I know what's going on. And repeat for the next 2 years for the rest of your life. But it's always about growth and learning, and because you talk about, like Odin talks about thought and memory and wisdom and wandering far and wide and learning things, and he's meant to be the far traveler. So you've got a sort of that sort of idea of wandering and learning and sort of finding out more.
Yeah, I always think of the story with him hanging on the world tree and then kind of gaining all the wisdom, and that idea that like nothing comes for free.
Yes.
And I think that's probably quite a nice message, that to get something that's worth it, sometimes you might have to do something that's maybe not quite as fun. I think that, to me, that would be the message I would take from it, but that's just because I don't like the way people keep trying to treat the universe like a vending machine.
Yes, that idea is not so good. I don't because I mean the other thing is the concept of this constant sort of I ask the gods to give me this, I ask the gods to give me this, and I'm never keen on that. Well, in any faith, really, because you should be doing stuff for yourself. You don't just make a prayer and then sit back and now we just play the waiting game. Well, it doesn't work like that, and it never has. And there was a great sort of it's just in a novel where this guy is wanting to make an offering for Odin. She says, but you've got to be careful, because if you pray for a good victory, doesn't mean it's going to be yours. Might be, because Odin's meant to be a bit of a sort of a bit sort of cunning like that. Says, well, there's a great victory. Your friend, that guy you hate. Well, they absolutely trounced you. You want the victory? Oh, yours? Sorry. So
be more specific.
Well, perhaps, but that sort of idea of because I mean, and also the gods are much more nuanced as well. I think it's important to say, because it's not like in a kind of your sort of Warhammer idea. This is the god of so and so. This is the god of this, because Odin is the god of hospitality, but also madness. He's also the god of fury and war, but also wisdom, and also blindness, and also all kinds of things that seem to be polar opposites. But he's not a dual god either, so it's never quite as clear, because often Thor is portrayed as being stupid, but also he was the most worshipped god that we have evidence for in historic times. Far more references to his name, or people taking his name, or Thorson and various sort of things sort of taken that, so it's much more common. It was Thor and Freya are the ones that we have most evidence for. Doesn't mean that the other gods weren't, but certainly Thor and Freya are the most ones that people had. Also, the thing about wearing a hammer, most of the evidence we have for people wearing a hammer is on women. So is that more women into Thor? And certainly Thor was meant to be the protector of Midgard, Earth. So he was a part of rituals to make things sacred. So he can't be that stupid. So, but it's obviously easy to kind of dumb things down and get sort of into that sort of silly perspective. I mean, sure, that's fine. And if people want to take, have a more sort of light-hearted approach, that's fine too, because I'm not precious about my faith, because just because somebody's going to make fun of it isn't going to change my beliefs.
Yeah, I think you get that in a lot of the pantheons, though, where they get sort of distilled down to like almost like which one you'd need to choose for a specific task. And I always kind of think that's a little bit like, you're not playing fantasy football, you're not sort of going, oh, who's going to be the best striker. It's like, you need to have a slightly more contextualized view. Like my favorite one is always Mars in the Roman pantheon, because he's both god of war but also god of agriculture. So it's kind of
fight those vegetables.
Yeah, and it's just there's so much more to him when you actually look into him, and you kind of think, so really all these people just kind of going, war, blood, and all this kind of thing. You're like, no, yeah, yes, and I think there's very much with a lot of these things, you need to have a both and attitude rather than that binary either or, and I think that helps with most spiritualities. Absolutely.
It's just he is the god of this and she is the god of that. Nice and easy. Well, yes, but no. I was going to mention if anybody is interested, that there's a very funny series of videos by this two Spanish guys called Pascu y Rodri, and they do like little mini rock songs with a little animation. It's all in Spanish, but one or two of them have subtitles, and they are, although they're silly, their mythology spot on, and they've done one on Mars, and they've done one on. There's one which has subtitles, which is Loki. The Loki one, they have subtitles for that one, and the Odin one is also very funny. And although I just about stumbled through my half broken Spanish, but as a brilliant potted version of the gods, it's brilliant because it has the scene where he hangs himself upside down. And so he gets all psychedelic, and you see all these runes spiraling around him, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's and Freya's portrayed as like a sort of like an older biker chick, so it's like, oh yeah, it is quite funny. But it's done. They've done like Demeter and Poseidon and various other ones on there, so that's a great sort of fun approach for some of those.
Cool. The last question I wanted to ask, because obviously people might have twigged that we've got very similar accents because we're basically from a very similar part of the world.
Yes.
It's like, can the world take two Geordies in the same show? Who knows?
Absolutely.
So obviously there's very, very heavy Scandinavian influence at one time in this part of the world. Obviously, particularly because Northumbria was ruled by the Vikings at one stage. So I suppose my question, obviously, to someone who's looked at like the academic side of this, is: would you say that we still see remnants of older beliefs within sort of northern folklore and legend? Like, I'm thinking of a lot of the worm stories that we've got. Or would you say that there's actually even older patterns of storytelling at work?
It's very hard to unpick some of these folklore from what's been adapted and retold, and things have folded in. There was one unusual story about sort of like an imp or something, which might have borrowed a little bit from the older stories involving Odin or Woden. That's one academic's theory, this particular, and some of the characteristics that are ascribed to this sort of creature who was going to sort of prey on people. But again, it gets a bit tenuous now. There is some words in language which have survived. I mean, famously, we talk about the word yem, I'm gan yem, I'm going home. But there's a couple of other words, which I probably won't repeat on your podcast, which are definitely from Scandinavian, quite rude, but are definitely from Scandinavian, and which is interesting. Although which is surprising, because but the majority of the Geordie accent, from what I've read, isn't Scandinavian. It's actually Old English vowels, wearing a sort of like a modern English hat. So essentially, all of our flat vowels. So instead of saying hat, we say hut. That flat sound. There's a video I saw about how English sounded in 13th century London. Now, I couldn't understand a word of it, but every single vowel, those are Geordie vowels. It's all these flat, sort of flat, or all those very, very flat vowels. I would certainly recognize. I couldn't understand what was being said, but I could, and that was really interesting. So essentially, you're getting all these old English vowels, these very flat things, but being inserted into a modern language. Quite why, I don't know, but that's probably a sociologist can probably tell you that. Maybe it's because people in the Northeast just never move away, they just stay here, possibly. Well, could be, and but that's certainly the thing. And in terms of people sort of, I think there are sort of elements and tiny little bits here and there, but it's so hard to sort of unpick that from all the layers of other sort of things that have happened in the Northeast. Because remember as well, there was of course the scouring of the North, which happened, William the Conqueror and his sort of servants who went to North and supposedly, although it's still debated, killed anything that moved because they hadn't paid fealty. So there could very well be just a line in the sand in terms of the historical record and the culture. Because I know when the people wanted to build, the monks moved up, who eventually became the ones at Durham and places like that. There was nobody up here. That's why they went to be given that land, because there was nobody there, or certainly not enough of a population to be relevant. Probably the odd village here and there, but not like a city. So it is likely that there was just a very much just a line in the sand in terms of that, because of what happened with William the Conqueror in that sort of period. Because there are survivals in places like Shetland and Orkney. There's sort of one or two bits in sort of folklore there that are provably linked back. There's one little fragment that somebody found in like the very late 19th century in Shetland, which has no written tradition. there's no surviving saga. It's not like not an Orkney saga. And this little old lady he knew or he met, she had this little garbled piece of verse about somebody hanging on a tree. And he went, oh, so probably Jesus? And she went, no, not sure who it was hanging on this tree, not him. Do you know anything more? Can't remember, don't know. And if you look at it and compare it with something from the Havamal, one of these sort of things in the Edda, you can see that's been kind of, but they never had that cultural wipeout that we had in the Northeast, unfortunately. So I think anything that might have survived, unfortunately, I mean, obviously York's a bit further south, so that would probably maybe, because it was an actual established town, might have survived a bit more, so a bit more survived there. But in terms of cultural thing, unfortunately, unless we find something really, maybe we'll find a Viking ship up in the hills sometime. You never know, fingers crossed.
That would be pretty brilliant. Well, that's all the questions that I had. I mean, obviously, if anyone else has any questions, obviously based on this, is it okay if they leave comments below,
yes.
and then you can obviously answer them better than I can?
Of course. I'm always happy to answer things like that, or they can get in touch with us via the website, and things like that. I mean, we've already done a huge event last year where we built this sort of 10-foot god post of Odin. Fantastic stuff, and we're doing one to Freya this summer. That'll be exciting. We've got a couple of big events there. We're hoping, fingers crossed, we're trying to work with somebody to get a little mini documentary on the BBC. Still in the works now. Can't give any more details than that, but fingers crossed on that one. So we shall see what happens. But we are going from strength to strength, and the future is bright for heathenry, I think.
Awesome. I'll put any of the links as well in the show notes,
sure,
so that people don't have to go Googling, because God knows where they'll end up.
So, thanks again, Icy. It's been lovely to chat.
It's always nice to chat to you as well. And I'll see you soon.